Hi, everyone. My name is Melina Vinsky, and I'm going to talk to you guys today about the search towards a behavioral toolkit and really creating an evidence-based and behaviorally driven framework to guide decision-making and experience design. So to introduce myself, my name is Melina, as I said, and I lead our behavioral science practice for the Canadian firm and the global community of practice as well. And to tell you a little bit about my team, we are a little bit nerdy. We love digging deep into the data, lifting the lid on organizations, crunching the numbers, looking at how things work, and most importantly, talking to people on the ground. And doing so allows us to develop theories of human decision making and behavior that help us uncover the why. And perhaps more importantly, inform the how to allow us to solve some of the toughest behavior change challenges facing our clients and society today. So, when we think about trying to solve a human behavior problem, we typically take a first step of some sort of analysis. And this analysis can be correlations, it can be qualitative as well. It can also be more sophisticated using machine learning or structural equation modeling or predictive analytics. But fundamentally, what we're trying to do is understand why are people behaving the way that they are. And so, in that sense, behavioral science and data science are two sides of the same coin. Behavioral science helps us interpret the data, and data helps us create very targeted solutions for change. And so when we're thinking about that one person and how the brain works, I'm going to dispel the great myths for you, where everybody here will be able to leave this session saying that they understand fundamentally human behavior, because it all boils down to one simple fact. And that is that anytime you are trying to perceive the world around you, um, there are a bunch of different data points that tend to rely the brain to crunch, right? So we've got a billion different points of data that we need to crunch, but in reality, we can only really process a few bits of that data at the same time. And so as a result, we tend to rely on what we call mental shortcuts that help us navigate our everyday life. And which shortcuts we take are very much dependent on the situations we're in, the people who surround us, and how we feel. And so, how we feel, for example, when we are in a crowd with a bunch of our friends listening to music is very different to how we feel when we're sitting alone, which is very different to how we feel in the warmth versus the rain, or how we feel during a sunset or in the middle of a blizzard. And I'm sure even showing you guys this photo of the snow makes everybody have a little bit of a chill. And for that, I apologize. But as the PwC behavioral team, we study how variability in these mental shortcuts lead to very predictable elements of behavior. And it's these predictable elements, these predictable patterns that allow us to really uncover some of those whys and hows. So, a great way of talking about predictable behavior is a simple question for you guys. So, I know that, for example, I'll ask you this question and you can think to yourself what the answer is. Perhaps majority of you want your desk to look like something on the left of the screen, but in reality, it looks more like on the right side, maybe a little bit more messy. And this gap between our intentions and the reality or our actual behavior is what we call the intention action gap. And it's one of the most predictable elements of human behavior. We have an intention on how we want to behave, and then we have our actual behavior, and that gap can widen and close at different points in time. What's really interesting is the intention action gap isn't just for our intentions, it's also true for our values as well. We may wake up in the morning a very moral person, not to lie, not wanting to do harm. But some point in the day, it varies and waxes and wanes. And that gap does exist fundamentally. So these gaps exist for our leaders, they exist for our employees, and this is true of employees that are working behind a desk, but also those that work with their hands. It's true of our teams, it's true of our citizens in the way that they move around, the way that they consume. And the way that we think about this is the gap is more likely to occur in three particular scenarios. The first scenario is in physical well being. So, this is in the food that we eat or the way that we move our body. But it's also true of our mental well-being. So, taking the time to truly reflect, to rebalance, to reground, to really connect with ourselves and make sure that we have low levels of anxiety or are taking care of our mental well-being. But it's also true of our financial well-being as well. Are we somebody that likes to spend our money on experiences and luxuries, or are we people who like to save a dollar for a rainy day? And this financial well-being, mental well-being, and physical well-being is where that intention action gap tends to wax and wane the most. So, when we're talking about the intention action gap, a lot of us in our organizations are, in fact, focused on the intention. The action is what actually happens, and the gap in between is our surprise. The difference between how we have planned versus how things have actually occurred. So, in that light, I like to think about it as the expectation reality gap. And we're so focused on the expectation that we're forgetting the gap. And that is where behavioral science and the application of behavioral science is truly fundamental, and is a differentiator, I think, for organizations that are thinking about and projecting into the long term, and capitalizing or calibrating, I should say, sorry, for some of those risks. So, as I mentioned earlier, which shortcuts we take are dependent on the situation we're in, the people who surround us, and how we feel. And these patterns are, in fact, predictable. And this is often when people turn to me and they say, oh, other people might be predictable, but I'm not. And so I'm just going to walk through some very simple case studies, some very simple tools to demonstrate in some of these situations how you can increase or decrease that gap. So, for example, if I was to ask some of you, when you go into the grocery store hungry, do you actually think that that influences how much you end up spending? And our moms always told us, don't go into the grocery store when you are hungry. And the truth is, people who do go into the grocery store leave with a 67% higher bill than people who are not hungry. And whenever I'm in an actual audience and I ask people this question, the statistics that people usually throw out are like, oh, 20%, 15%, but it's 67%. And this is because of something that we call priming. And the fundamental aspect around priming is that how our emotional state, our cognitive state is primed, then influences how we subsequently make decisions. So in this case, it's the feeling of hunger, but it can also be about how people are framing a decision. So, for example, customers that are asked to think about memory needs before buying a computer actually end up choosing a computer that has more processing speed than others. Or, for example, having people write an essay about their desired legacy for the long run actually increases the amount of donations that they will make to environmental organizations today. It is the thought of themselves and what they want to be in the future that then primes their decision to act today. Another example is imagining feeling proud or guilty about pro environmental decisions lead people to be more pro environmental in their product decision making. So again, you're putting yourself into the state of being proud or guilty, and it leads to people to tend to choose a more green option. Another example is simplicity. So the number of options that we have, for example, for in front of us. So for example, reducing the number of saving options has been shown to increase participation rates in long-term saving products by as much as 14%. And we know those long-term product savings are the gap can be quite high between an intention to save and actually saving. But also, reducing technical language tends to not only increase the perception or the understanding of advice, it also changes the perceived expertise and trust of that partner that is providing that advice, and also the intention to seek advice. So that feed forward and reciprocity loop of communication with an advisor, a trusted advisor, and a customer. And this is just by removing some of that technical language. Another example of increasing or decreasing that gap is through what we call implementation intentions. And this is just a fancy word for making a plan to then do a behavior to decrease the likelihood that we will procrastinate or not do that behavior. And so an example is indicating when and where citizens would vote has actually been shown to increase voter turnout by 10%. And what's so great about this is very much being used by the Biden campaign right now, not to get too political. This showed very effective in Obama's first run and second run for the White House. And you can see the get out to vote message is extremely strong and prominent on the Democrat side today. And a lot of that has to do with implementation intentions and that gap between people saying they're going to vote and people actually voting, that gap. But another example is having a plan to save in place is actually the most effective way to boost long-term savings. Another example of how to increase or decrease that gap is through something called salience. So we have a tendency to put off things in the future or discount things in the future because we would rather enjoy today. So we would rather eat that bag of chips, even if we know in the long run that that's going to make us gain a pound or two, let's say. And salience is one of the best ways we can get over that. So, for example, showing future prices of household staples like milk or utilities have prompted 60% more people to investigate retirement options and contribute to their environment. And a great example of this is actually the Wealth Simple campaigns. These are sort of everywhere, everybody knows them. And it's the idea that you've got this young kid who's constantly in a battle with his older self to try and figure out what's the best decision for the younger person to make so that the older person is in fact happy. And there's great examples of this in the financial services sector, where you have, for example, an opportunity along a spectrum to say how much you're going to save for your retirement. And it's got a picture of you on one side today and a picture of you when you're older, and it actually ages you. And the more you go up that scale, the happier the face gets, meaning the more that you contribute to your retirement, the happier you're going to be. And just the act of seeing yourself old and happy is enough to change the way that you then contribute to your retirement. And this is all just making retirement salient in your mind, where otherwise it's a very abstract object. Another way that you can really change behavior and change that gap is to think about social influence. So we all hear all the time, we are social beings, we are strongly influenced by others, we are better as a whole together than we are individually. Our brains have evolved the way that they have because of social influence. And so naturally, other people's behavior guides our own. And a great example of this is social guidance. So for example, 35% of Amazon's revenue comes from a recommendation engine, a third of Amazon's revenue. If you think about how much money that company makes, it's incredible to think that a third is just by recommendations from other people. But it also works in the workplace as well. So, for example, converting 25% of an employee population to a new way of working seems to be the critical point for creating systemic change. Another tool that people have that they often use is what we call framing. So similar to salience, similar to priming, how a choice is framed can greatly influence the subsequent choice that is made. So for example, using the term fresh in front of Florida oranges has been shown to increase consumption by as much as 20%. Think about that. Maybe with kids, they won't eat their vegetables if you just say they're fresh, or if they're yummy, maybe it'll have a similar effect. But it does actually really work. And this is also true in the way that how you frame language. So avoiding negative language such as can't, won't, or that's our policy actually increases customer effort score by as much as 18% better than industry peers. So this is just taking negative language, turning it positive, and it drastically changes customer satisfaction and perception. Another example, customers are 27% more likely to participate in a savings program when an option is framed as $5 a day rather than $150 a month. And of course, $5 a day equates to more than $150 a month, but the framing of the option up front is drastically different, right? So people are more likely to choose 5 because it seems more digestible, if that's the right word. And so I'm hoping that in showing some of these examples, obviously you have been able to see, maybe in reflecting in your own behavior, some of your own examples in your life, in your day-to-day, how maybe some of these tactics or tools might increase or decrease the likelihood of that gap existing. And so I'm hoping that I'm reinforcing and allowing you to see that these patterns are in fact predictable. And that when you're thinking about your customers, when you're thinking about your employees, when you are crafting your strategy for the future, when you are choosing between pathway X or pathway Y, or cutting this part of your business or growing that part of your business, I want you to think about how much of the assumptions that are based in making those decisions are in fact based on intentions, what people intend to do, and thinking about that in terms of your expectation. So, how is that framing your expectation of how you think that the future will be, and the assumptions in there? And what I really want you to do is to focus on the gap. I want you to think about how behavioral science plays a role, the human centered component of the gap between how people think they will behave versus how they actually do, and focusing on the gap when assessing the pros and cons or the trade offs of your organizations and the next steps that you have to take. And with that, I'm hoping that what you do get out of today is an understanding that that gap does exist, an understanding of the importance of having a behavioral mindset when focusing and mapping and calibrating against that gap. And in doing so, that we can create evidence based, behaviorally informed designs of our organizations and more broadly society. And I think doing so can help us all live a little bit better together. And with that, I'll leave you guys with my contact information. My name is Melina Vinsky, as mentioned. I'm with PwC's behavioral team, and I am happy to answer any of your questions that you guys might have throughout this conference or, of course, after. And I just want to give a small thank you to the WNORTH team for being so quick to be agile and shift and have another pathway forward for all of us to be able to connect. And with that, I'll say goodbye.